Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me again for another episode of the Swift Half with Snowdon. With me, Christopher Snowdon, and as always, with a fascinating guest. I'm particularly delighted to welcome our guest this week. He is Mark Schrad. He is Professor of Political Science at Villanova University College of Liberal Arts and Science over in America. And he wrote a book, which I wrote a review of a few months ago, all about prohibition. It's a bit of a doorstopper. It is called Smashing the Liquor Machine, a global history of prohibition. And I, as I say in the review, I disagree with some of its premises, but it's a fantastic book, an incredibly well-researched book, very valuable book, apart from anything else, because it looks beyond the USA to prohibition movements in Central Europe, in Africa, all over the world. A lot of people don't realize that prohibition was very much a global movement. Now, this is not a history show, as you know, folks, and some of you may not be familiar with US prohibition. So, Mark, if I could start off by asking you what the conventional view of prohibition has been in history books down the years, which you then go on to challenge in your own book.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. This will be hopefully a very fun and enlightening discussion. But so prohibition, comes from the, most people date it from the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited the buying, selling, trading of alcoholic beverages. And that lasted from 1919 through its repeal in 1933. And the conventional wisdom, we've kind of gone through a couple of different iterations of it. The first was that it was some sort of puritanical cabal in Washington, D.C., that it was something that was put over on the American people. But in beginning about the 1960s, the conventional wisdom kind of shifted to kind of a culture clash, that this was sort of the last gasp of rural evangelical Protestants, sort of white nativists, sort of Midwesterners, rebelling against the pressures of modernization and immigration, and wanting to discipline the leisure is always the terminology that they use, of sort of African Americans, of Native Americans, of immigrants, and so that always seemed to be the conventional wisdom, was that this was culture politics. It was Bible thumpers telling you what thou shalt and thou shalt not drink.
Right. And in your book, I mean, let's go back to the cultural war kind of thing. So that was Joseph Gusfield in Symbolic Crusade. And I do share your skepticism about his view, because I think it's rather simplistic and it's a bit too easy to just make this a kind of, well, literally a symbolic issue, a totemic issue, that it wasn't really about alcohol at all. It was actually about the fear of immigrants and fear of non-Protestants and people who were already in America wanting to try and secure their power. I do agree with you, that's a bit too easy. But in your book, you very much take the view that these people who were campaigning for prohibition were progressives. I mean, they called themselves progressives in their own time, and that essentially, would I be misrepresenting to say that you show quite a bit of sympathy for the prohibition movement? Certainly not more sympathy than most historians have shown to them over the years. Because you're not, let's be clear, you're not a teetotaler yourself, right? You're a drinker.
I probably drink a lot more than I should.
And you accept that prohibition was a failure. It's not like you're in favor of prohibition, but you do think that these guys had a point.
Well, I think for me, it was more about sort of historical explanation, trying to figure out something is not right. Like when you're reading through something and things just aren't quite making sense, and so we in the States, we have quite a history of thinking that we're right and then taking what we think is right and kind of exporting it to the rest of the world. So I've had friends. The last time I was in London, was at this conference, and I was speaking with a colleague who teaches down in Mexico City. She did her dissertation on why is there an anti-alcohol plank in the Mexican Constitution of 1917. Right. So the most progressive constitution in the world at that point in time. And she's like, okay, well, the Americans seem to think that it's about Bible thumping evangelical Protestants. So she did her entire dissertation in, Catholic Mexico, looking for Bible thumping evangelical Protestants, because that's what we say causes prohibition. And she found none, right? A couple here and there, but certainly not enough to influence the Mexican Constitution. And so that's, that just raised this idea of, okay, well, maybe there's something more going on here. Maybe there's, because my area of interest is Russia, the former Soviet Union. And I did, my previous book was, it's called, Vodka Politics. It's kind of a drunk history of Russia. And they were the first prohibition country in 1914. And there aren't a whole lot of Bible thumping evangelical Protestants there. And so I was very curious to kind of see, okay, well, the entire idea behind the new book was, okay, I'm just going to put the American conventional wisdom on the shelf. I just want to see what prohibition was like in the rest of the world, get a larger sample size rather than kind of extrapolating from a single case study, see what it is in the rest of the world. And the idea was that it would be like 8 chapters, about half the size that it is. And then there'd be like a nice tidy 1 chapter on sort of what did we learn? What can we find out about American politics? And one of the things you find, sort of the continuity is that it was kind of a progressive movement. But in much of the rest of the world, it was also kind of resistance against sort of imperial domination, right? And so it was, in South Africa and in Bechuanaland, Botswana, it was the locals trying to protect their health against, what they call the white man's wicked water, right? And you had the same dynamics in India with Gandhi. You had the same dynamics in Ataturk, who was probably the drunkest leader in all of world history. But you had prohibition being consistent with that as well. But the idea was that it was, recognizing that the sale of alcohol, especially before, in a world before income taxes, that's how states made their money. And so the idea was that we want, if somebody's going to exploit our people, it should be us, not somebody else, right? And so we need to protect our community against these alcoholic incursions and keep everybody else out. And so that was the idea, it was supposed to be this. And then I gave kind of a presentation here at Villanova to one of my colleagues. And she said to me, she's like, okay, if I'm going to buy this thesis of yours that temperance is not Bible thumpers, but it's sort of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, or what that, she says, where are the Native Americans in your story? Where are the Native Americans? I don't see them. And I was like, oh crap, you're right. You're absolutely right. They're not there. And so that was the moment where this thing became the giant doorstop that you found. Took me 2 more years to kind of make, essentially the second half of the book becomes about American politics, because when you start to change your worldview and recognize it, as prohibition and temperance as not being some sort of moralistic movement, but actually kind of, a movement against sort of the worst excesses of predatory capitalism, you find that America's first prohibitionists were its first peoples. The first prohibitionists were the Native Americans, and then, African Americans, abolitionists, suffragists, on down the line. It becomes this kind of calling card of community protection against, this alcoholic capitalism of getting people addicted, to a substance and then essentially bleeding them and their entire families dry. And so that's, kind of where it all came from. And it was really fun to do because, it was born of just sort of a historical interest of, okay, something's not right here, in terms of, the story that I'm usually being told. And then it took me way down all these different alternative avenues and paths that I never thought I would ever, spend all these, spend months and years, researching Native American politics in the American West.
So you've got places like the southern states of Africa where you can say it was an anti-imperialist movement. Some of the other countries too, presumably not in America. The temperance movement in Britain wasn't anti-imperialist. Temperance movement in Russia, I guess, wasn't anti-imperialist, although they may have their own reasons. And your stuff about Russia is absolutely fascinating. The corrupt way that the state, effectively the state alcohol industry works. But wouldn't Occam's razor just say, well, actually it was about alcohol, right? It wasn't, Gusfield was wrong when he tried to bring a sociological explanation to it. It was actually people don't like it. There are always some people who don't like alcohol, want to get rid of it. And at times they've had the upper hand over the people who just want to drink. What's wrong with that as an explanation? That it really is just as simple as it's about alcohol and there's these other politics come into it, but actually some people really hated alcohol.
Yeah, I'm with you on the Gusfield stuff, because the idea that you can fashion alcohol to become a symbol, well, you can make it a symbol of whatever you want. If as long as you kind of have a compelling story behind it, you say something's a symbol, and then it just takes away from what they were talking about, right? That focus on alcohol. But the only thing I would add is that it wasn't necessarily against alcohol; it was against what they talked about as the liquor trade, the liquor traffic. It wasn't the stuff in the bottle necessarily; it was people making money off of it, and sort of making money off of other people's misery was the thing. So I think I mentioned in the book, like the foremost American prohibitionist organization was the Anti-Saloon League, right? They were against the saloon, and so like Gusfield is well, the saloon was it was a symbol. It was a symbol of male leisure and a symbol of all this. No, it was the saloon. That was the place where they made the money. Getting men drunk and then taking all their money away, right? So they didn't call it wasn't the Anti-Leisure Drinking Society, it was the Anti-Saloon League. They're very explicit about this.
But wasn't there an element of spin in that, right?
Yeah.
They're actually they were against alcohol, but they realized that the saloon was probably the least acceptable face of the alcohol business. So they said, well, we won't say that we're anti-drinking, even though we are. We'll just say we're anti-saloon, because that'll get more people on side. And if they were truly just anti-saloon, why didn't they just close the saloons? Why were they banning mail order sale of alcohol and things like this?
Yeah, and so that becomes very interesting to see. Like the focus is always on the saloon, and then people would sort of utilizing that framework, that this is some sort of kind of a manipulative thing, that they're just kind of cloaking their actual intentions. We'll kind of point out that some people would ultimately utilize alcohol in different ways, right? So prohibitionists. One of my favorite guys is Pussyfoot Johnson. I'm going to work on his biography next.
Oh, great.
It says, I don't mind taking a drink every now and then. He drank when he was thirsty in the desert. Tolstoy in Russia was probably the biggest temperance voice in Russia, and he would have some wine with dinner, and when he had a cold, he'd drink some whiskey. But the idea was that he wasn't supporting sort of the liquor industry, sort of the czarist government that's making money off of this, or the fat cat capitalists who are making money off of people's misery in that sort of way. And so it's easy for us to kind of look back on that and say, oh well, they're hypocrites, that they're preaching one thing and then doing the other. But it also makes a lot more sense if you recognize that, the saloon of old really was kind of a scourge on the local community. It really was, one of the things I talk about in the conclusion of the book is, what I call the Ted Danson effect. Here in the United States, we kind of, we've got Ted Danson. He had this show Cheers about this Boston pub, where, people come in at the end of a long day, and the bartender's there to bend your ear and listen to your sob stories, and then have a couple drinks, and then pack you in a cab and send you on. He's a good guy, right? And I think that's kind of what we're all used to. But like before prohibition and before sort of regulation in other countries, including the UK, pubs were awful places. That was the sort of the hotbed of the local local prostitution and gambling rings, and whatnot. So it was very interesting to see, like, wow, this was really, really bad. And you didn't have to be sort of a dyed in the wool, Carrie Nation type to recognize that, wow, this is really, really bad for the local community. Personally, I think that that prohibition definitely went too far, and I think the actual substance of it kind of took on a life of its own in some ways. When it came to like the Volstead Act, which essentially enacted it here in the United States, there were a lot of debates as to, okay, well, how much alcohol can we allow? Can you allow for light beer? Does that count? Because much of temperance was not so much against beer and wine as it was against distilled liquors, vodkas, rums, whiskeys, gins. That was the stuff that people were like, wow, this is of a potency that's just light years ahead of fermented beverages. And so when it came to the actual substance of the Volstead Act, suggesting that I think it was 0.2% alcohol by volume, a lot of people were surprised by that, because they're like, wait, we signed up for perhaps restrictions on the whiskey trade, but maybe, leave the sacramental wines alone, maybe leave the workers' beers alone, so at the pub after a long day of, in the factories and whatnot. So there's a lot of moving parts.
Isn't that in itself interesting, right? The people got
Yeah.
caught in this sort of bait and switch. They believed this rhetoric coming from the temperance lobby, the prohibition lobby. And once that lobby got the upper hand, they actually revealed who they really were.
Yeah, you could look at it that way,
But you kind of, I mean, one of the reasons I disagree with some of what you say is because it seems to me, reading the book, having read quite a lot of prohibition literature over the years, I wrote a bit of a book about it myself over a decade ago. A lot of your language, you're always talking about, just going from the very title, smashing the liquor machine. That's a very kind of prohibitionist. It's very prohibitionist terminology, and you often use the words exploitative or predatory when you're talking about the liquor traffic, the liquor trust, whatever it may be. But it might be all well and good for someone like Pussyfoot Johnson, who's in a position where maybe you can get a drink every now and again. But if you're just a normal working man or woman who wants to get a drink, how are you supposed to do that without there being an alcohol industry? This is my problem. You see, the prohibitionist people always frame this as being, it's us, the little guys, against this big evil industry. And no doubt there were all sorts of problems with the booze industry back then. But without it, it's not actually possible for somebody living in a New York tenement flat to get a drink at all. If you're a farmer, you can make your own cider. That's all well and good. If you've got a bit of money, maybe you can find some booze that's been stashed away in a cellar somewhere. But the argument that you make in the book, which is that these people, A, they weren't really anti-drinking. They were just an anti-alcohol industry. And B, they weren't really against freedom. I want to come on to your arguments about liberty in a moment. It seems to me that they were very much anti-alcohol, and that was revealed really when they got any element of power in their hands, and that the freedom to buy something is indivisible from the freedom to sell it. So you can't just say, well, we're just going to stop this nasty industry from selling it. We're not taking away anyone's freedom, because in effect, you are taking away the freedom of normal people to buy a drink.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to hit on that one first, or should we go? Yeah, the freedom is, I'll give you like an insight into this whole thing. That's the position, my wife took, for years on this, that, how can you disaggregate between the freedom to buy something and the freedom to sell something? It's just the same thing. And so, every time that I would work on something and it'd be like, this is what's going on in Sweden or in Germany or in Belgium or whatnot. And she would be sort of, the one who's like, I understand what you're saying, but there's still no difference. There's no difference between the right to buy and the right to sell, and all that. And so the book title originally wasn't supposed to be, smashing the liquor machine. That actually came from, it really was a phrase that was found in the temperance literature. I originally wanted to call it the global war on booze, right, with a focus on the actual alcohol itself. Lisa McGurr has a book called The War on Alcohol. And as I got into it, I recognized more and more that it really, again, it wasn't so much about the stuff in the bottle as much as it was about the entire system, the political machinations, the kind of corruption that it engenders and all that. But to get to your point, yeah, I still kept coming back to this whole notion of how can, these people have possibly been able to say kind of with a straight face that they're not against alcohol, but they're against the predatory capitalism of selling people alcohol, because ultimately those are the same thing, right? And so one of the things that kind of my aha moment on this, I was reading some articles in this international journal by a couple of alcohol control researchers in Finland, and they gave us this argument that that in Scandinavia in particular, that they look at alcohol control in a different way than we do in the United States and in the UK. And they trace it back to sort of the rise of that kind of Hayekian neoliberalism, the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, that kind of suggests that any infringement upon someone's economic liberties is necessarily an infringement upon their political liberties as well. And they said, well, we don't have that in Sweden, and we don't have that in Finland, and so we don't quite vilify people the same way. And I kind of was like, oh, that makes sense. The idea that we used to have kind of we used to have political liberties over here, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. Then we had sort of, the economic liberties of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, all that. And there was kind of a firewall between them, but only in the United States and the UK to some degree, with the rise of, sort of this neoliberalism, Thatcherism, Reaganism, and we've all kind of grown up with this understanding that, of course, liberty is liberty and always has been liberty. The liberty to buy and sell. But if you look back at the, not just the arguments that temperance people were making, but the actual, I guess, findings and the declarations of the U.S. Supreme Court at that point in time, really were on that side. They recognized that, there is no political liberty, there is no political freedom to sell things that would be harmful to the population. In the Constitution, right? It's not enumerated anywhere in there. And so, that's how a lot of this stuff, it wasn't just sort of, again, this kind of small cabal of Protestants. It was kind of a recognized political understanding at that point in time that that these are separate things, that your freedom to buy and sell is not absolute. And it's certainly not something that's ensconced in our political documents. And so that's something that we've kind of blurred over all the time. And one of, the things that I kind of, this is, I guess, more of an issue of me trying to get people today to understand like how people 100 years ago could have thought this way. And it's not so much that they are crazy or not so much that they are wrong, but it's like we're looking through kind of a historical distortion, that our sort of modern day conceptions of freedom and liberty are pretty different from what they conceive freedom and liberty to be. And so we, since we're living in the present, we assume that freedom is freedom, and everybody has always had the same conceptions of it ever, forever and ever, without recognizing how these things have changed up and down over time.
But even if one accepts that, and I think I probably do accept that commercial freedoms are probably less protected than, for example, the freedom of speech or something like that in the USA, at least. But that still doesn't get you around the problem that in practice, if you destroy a legal industry, then I can no longer legally buy something, and that is a freedom that that's been removed from me. And anything else seems to me to be sophistry, really. That I do want to buy alcohol. Lots of people wanted to buy alcohol in the USA. I'm pretty sure that during Prohibition, a lot of people felt that their liberty had been restricted by this, oh, yeah. Right? So it's not just us now having gone through Thatcher and Reagan that made people feel like this. It is a genuine liberty that's been taken away, however much they may have dressed it up in different arguments at the time.
Sure. And that's, for me, it's, like I said, I'm after this whole thing, I'll probably go crack a beer myself, and whatnot. So for me, it wasn't so much about trying to, see what sort of values or understandings, present day understandings we have here. For me, it was just trying to figure out like this historical enigma, this very bizarre thing that happened in our, history, and try to figure out, okay, how was that even possible? Because again, having grown up in this environment, it seems so ridiculous. It seems so unlikely, and it seems so, practically anti-American to say, that they want to take away your freedom, that they want to take away your liberty. Well, if that's true, and that's kind of where I started with this whole thing, then how is that even possible, right? That to get, a constitutional amendment passed and to get all these people associated with it. And so certainly it wasn't, overwhelming. Certainly it wasn't, it wasn't like, 95% of the people said, right, we're on board with this whole thing. And it's kind of hard to measure. We don't have, public opinion polls that go back that far. But certainly, yeah, there were people who were vehemently against it, and they were arguing that same argument of freedom and liberty. And actually, where I trace it to in the book, goes back to John Stuart Mill. His On Liberty is, if you go back and read it, it is very much an anti-prohibition pamphlet. That's what he was writing against, was against the prohibition of alcohol, which started with the Maine law in the United States in 1851, started to wash up a little bit in the UK, and John Stuart Mill just kind of puts a smackdown on it, right? Based upon these basic sense of liberty and freedom that has kind of become that mainstay, right?
That was way back in 1859, I think, right? This is
right.
long before the prohibitionists. So clearly the idea that the freedom to buy and sell alcohol was an issue of liberty existed pre-Hayek, for example.
Right. But like it was a multiplicity, right? So people are arguing this back and forth. And I think a lot of, a lot of Americans, anti-prohibitionists, were standing up for that based upon principle. And so, you had anti-prohibitionists who were part of that liquor industry, to be sure, and it was self-interest in some degree, but also a lot of people who were earnestly arguing on behalf of broader political principles. And, again, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty was kind of their Bible, for that, because it was written explicitly as an anti-prohibitionist tome.
It's my Bible as well, I have to tell you. We've only got about 5 minutes left. I want to ask you about how you view alcohol policy today, what you think the ideal system is. Clearly, it's not prohibition. Reading between the lines, I sense that you had a bit of sympathy for a more Scandinavian style of alcohol policy, maybe state-owned shops, state-owned industry. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have like a personal prescription. Aside from, I could see where you get like the sympathies, especially for the Swedish model. Yeah. Because again, if you go back 150 years ago, Sweden kind of looked like Russia, a drunken backwoods on the periphery of Europe, and they adopt this system that's even though they had in the Riksdag 2/3 of the members were card-carrying temperance members, they did not institute a prohibition, but rather a system of alcohol control that seemed to minimize a lot of the social harms without impeding overly the access to alcohol. People still had access. I thought that was, that seemed to be a good solution to the problems as they existed at that point in time for those particular people, right? And the United States was interesting because it allowed, we had, state level variety, right? So you had some states were dry states, you had some that were kind of liquor control states, you had other ones that were high license states where and so people could kind of see how all these different alternative policy systems were playing at the same time and kind of measure their outcomes in different ways, right? And so I think the ultimate, and then of course after prohibition ends in 1933, it kind of snaps back to control at the state level, and you can kind of look at those different sort of policy arrangements. Personally, I think dry states kind of are an abomination, especially there's still dry states, dry counties in the American South, which are just awful. There's some of the poorest communities anywhere in the United States tend to be the dry counties. But I do think, there's something to be said for, a happy medium between, total prohibition and total kind of unfettered free market. Something in the middle. Of course, I don't know exactly where that middle would be, and it would probably vary from one community to another and one state to another.
But you think some of the US states are about right these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun because, when you go from one state to another, you don't quite understand what the alcohol laws are. So I moved out here. I'm from Iowa in the Midwest originally. I moved out here to Pennsylvania, and I went to, when we were scouting out homes in the area, I went to a beer store, and I went and grabbed a 6-pack of beer, and they looked at me funny, and I was like, what? They said, well, this is a beer store, you can't buy that. I'm like, it's beer, I'm in a beer store. They said, well, here in Pennsylvania, if you go to a beer store, you can only buy it by the case. You have to buy an entire case of alcohol. I don't know if that was like a holdover, like you had to confront the amount of alcohol that you're about to drink or something like that. But as it was, the beer stores, you had to buy cases. Everything else, you had to go to a bar and pay like retail instead of just getting like and it's the same, I guess, with wine as well. So you had wine stores.
They force you to buy more than you want, effectively. This is a pro-drunken policy, really.
Yeah, and so it's changed. We're making progress. I think 6 years ago they kind of started to loosen up. Now you can buy 6-packs at your grocery store and all over the place. But yeah, just like these weird remnants of the past that kind of come out in different ways. But certainly I'm not a prohibitionist. And again, those dry counties in the South. I still remember one of my formative. I was in Arkansas in a dry county where my grandparents had retired to, and I was with my uncle, who was kind of local to that area of Arkansas, and we had to drive I think it was 40 miles each way just to get to the state line to buy alcohol. And it was a big family thing. So we, piling all sorts of alcohol into the car. And my uncle was explaining to me, he says, in the state of Arkansas, you can get any measure on the ballot as a statewide ballot initiative. All you have to do is gather 10,000 signatures. And he says, except if you want to try to reform the alcohol laws, then you have to get 100,000 signatures, which is just prohibitive to try to amass that kind of thing. And he goes off on this rant. He says, it would be easier for me to put on a ballot measure that mandates there be a brothel next to every church in this state than to actually have, the ability to have some wine with dinner, And so
I wonder if there's a bootleggers and Baptists element to that. So just quickly before we go, I don't think you mentioned Iceland in your book. I was there a few years ago. Have you followed their story of prohibition? Because I found it hilarious, really.
Oh yeah. I was at a conference in Milan, and I sort of worked with this guy from Iceland who wrote like a whole thing on the Icelandic. So they had prohibition for a while until the Spanish pressured them that they would not buy their cod, I think, or buy their fish until they liberalized their policies. And so they
legalized wine at that point.
They legalized wine,
but they didn't legalize beer until 1989.
Yeah. And so it's crazy, in some ways to look at these kind of these historical elements. But yeah, the Iceland story is another one of those kind of little crazy remnants of history that are really fascinating to try to understand.
And to this day, it's very, very expensive to buy any alcohol in Iceland, I can tell you. I think, having been in one of their state-owned off licenses, we'd call them in the UK, I'm pretty sure they're not allowed to keep the beer in the fridge either. They were all on big pallets in a room that was notably colder than the rest of the building, presumably as some were trying to get around this ban on keeping it in the fridge. We're out of time, Mark. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I would recommend anybody, if you're interested in the subject of prohibition, to have a look at this very fine book, controversial book, and see what you think. But Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's a pleasure reading your book. Thank you for taking my constructive criticism well, and I hope to speak to you again sometime. You at home, take care. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another interview. In the meantime, if you'd like to donate to us, please do. You know how to do that, iea.org.uk/donate or patreon.com/IEA London. Thank you for watching. Thank you to our donors. Take care and goodbye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.